Okay, great. Thank you very much. Delighted to be here to talk about some of the research and work I've been doing on corporate environmentalism. So what I study and teach about is how companies can become more environmentally friendly. Majority of this is within the global context, although over the last 4 to 5 years I've been focusing increasingly on China. And I think that this idea of corporate environmentalism is very important because a lot of attention is placed on government policy, things government should do, and technology as well, sort of ways of having more green technology. But as well, something that's very important is human capital, skills, processes within companies that can help them become more environmentally friendly. So beyond just sort of what the government can do, what technology can do, actually a lot of the story is about what actually happens inside of companies, inside of organizations, and I'm going to be discussing some work on China in this. Okay. So the two things we're going to talk about today are related. One is sort of the trends in the Chinese environmental policies, particularly as they impact companies. Companies are the key actors that actually emit pollution from their factories, and actually changing them is really critical to creating a more sustainable and environmentally friendly country. But a big sort of detriment to some extent is that the skills, processes needed to actually upgrade are missing in many cases. And the government actually is working intensively to help companies upgrade, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that's been done in that. Before diving in, I just want to say, so much of the talk I'm going to be talking about, things that I think can be interpreted rather positively, things that are moving in the right direction. But I've been coming to China for a while now, and every time I feel that the environment is getting worse. This was just highlighted when I was here in January during what the Western media call the airpocalypse. Really a tragedy beyond sort of all dimensions. First time I was in China that I felt physically ill because of the natural environment. And you can see here some of the numbers. This is 755 on the air quality index. It's not exactly, so the PM level is actually a component of that, sort of a little bit lower. But here you can see globally looking at sort of environmental quality levels, and you can see the index goes up to 80, and today in Beijing it's well over sort of well over 80, about 150. In Shanghai it's about 40 to 50. Here you can see China, the big red spot. So things are still quite obviously quite severe. Obviously we wouldn't all be here. It's pointed out by a lot of observers of this. I talked to people in China, China, the Western media. Key thing is, that the environmental laws are actually very stringent, perhaps even more stringent than in the United States. And the issue is that there's just a gap between the laws that the Chinese passed, particularly after the, sort of joining the WTO, and that there's this gap. So one of the studies that I've done actually has sort of analyzed both through interviews as well as looking at sort of the laws and enforcement, how it's changed. That actually over time there has been increasing movements in, So the enforcement has actually become a little bit more stringent, and there's this gap between regulation and enforcement has been closing quite a bit. So we identified this as a number of different dimensions, so priorities and incentives, bureaucratic alignment, and transparency and monitoring. So a lot of goals are being set and actually hit. Bureaucratic alignments, the MEP has been elevated more recently to a sort of higher level in the government to have more authority. And I think that a real important one to understand how both the government can sort of enforce and monitor, but also civil society can play an important role, are issues of transparency and monitoring. So even the idea that PM 2.5 and hundreds of sort of I think currently 100 and soon to be hundreds of cities you can get on your cell phone, you can track online from the Chinese government PM 2.5 levels. Also importantly from the work that I do and study is on companies have very much focused on increasing the transparency, and the government and international actors have been focusing on this as well. So one of the key goals, obviously, sort of key sets of priorities and goals are the 5-year plans. So here are just some examples of sort of how a number of environmental targets were hit. Of course, there's the sort of well-known critique that the government just shut down about a bunch of factories towards the end of the period. But I do want to point out that there is some positive effects of this. So here's some analysis done by the Harvard Center for the Environment, looking at actually the sulfur dioxide decreases as a result of the 11th five-year plan, some simulations based on what would have occurred had the 12th five-year plan not happened, and some as you can see from this graph, the blue area sort of shows the decrease, more obviously in the winter months, and based on this analysis, calculate tens of thousands of lives have been sold. So, a positive thing. The 12th five-year plan then, to some extent, doubled down on many of these goals and objectives and added many more other very important, and as I described, sort of ambitious and ambiguous goals, like increasing strategic industries, et cetera. So I think this is sort of important because, in many ways, when you saw the 11th five-year plan goals, this was to some extent the low-hanging fruit. So, it's very easy to shut factories down. It's very easy to force them to put equipment in their smokestacks. But actually to, continue improving, to continue actually in some of these more ambiguous goals, really it's a much more deeper issue of developing skills and motivation. So not just a, sort of coercion and forcing things to close, but actually, developing actual sort of skills and capabilities in this area. Here's just a quick thing. So the context I'll be talking a little bit about here on this issue of skills and human capital development is on sustainability reporting. So this is companies, for the most part voluntarily, issuing reports and data about their environmental and social issues. So the CSR stands for Corporate Social Responsibility. These have sort of the label for these reports, CSR or sustainability reports. I'll use mostly CSR just because it's actually a little shorter. It's a little bit easier to be on the slide. But most of these actually include environmental data. So I've done a number of sort of academic studies and case studies on this. Globally, this push towards companies being transparent has really taken off. And important in this is actually there's a set of global standards. One of the main standards is called the Global Reporting Initiative, and companies then get sort of monitored, evaluated, et cetera, on this on the reports. And these reports, have the GRI standard, for instance, focuses on about 130 different indicators, trying to make it sort of akin to financial reports, so that companies can be compared both over time and across companies. So I did a comparative study of two Chinese organizations on how they actually introduced and developed a capability of this sustainability reporting. So one of them is Costco, the other is State Grid. Both of these were two of the earliest companies that started this practice, and to some extent internationally and nationally lauded. Here is Costco. So I interviewed a number of people inside the organization, but also the CEO, Captain Wei Jiafu. And he talked about the importance of this for the global audience. This is a picture of him sitting with Ban Ki-moon being sort of celebrated for their sustainability reporting. So global company, obviously. State Grid, sort of on the opposite perspective of, if Costco is very global, exists in 150 countries, shipping across the world. State Grid is a power grid company, very, very bound to the locality. So here you can see the comparison between the two of them. And the reason why we chose these two companies is because, this is a global practice that is being introduced, a set of skills that need to be developed to meet sort of global needs. How would a global company do it versus how would a more sort of locally, domestically focused company do it? So here's it was mostly based on sort of interviews and text analysis of these documents and internal reports. Interviewed about 50 people, not just people at the company, but a lot of sustainability consultants, a number of people in the government. And then these documents actually exist that can be analyzed themselves. So this was so based on this analysis, what I'm going to discuss a little bit here is actually understanding how these global skills end up being imported and the human capital developed to sort of enact them sort of developed this model here that focuses on sort of three different areas, which I'll drill down a little bit more here. So I'll go through this in slight more detail. So, Costco implemented their approach in what we call sort of a new wine and new bottles approach. It's what the standard sort of globalization theory, what global actors, global sort of NGOs and activists would really promote companies to do. So global organizations actually work directly with the company to introduce the standards. The company then has to change itself internally to actually introduce a new global standard. So, a bunch of actually about 2 years of work had to be done within Costco in order for them to be able to, introduce this global standard. They actually created an MIS system to track and monitor and report on their system. So, in this ways, because they've actually had to do all this work, it actually leads to extensive restructuring. On the opposite side, State Grid is an example of a company in the way they did it actually. So they actually had practices themselves. So took their existing work and actually modified the standards to actually meet the work that they were doing already. So on the one hand, where Costco took the standards and modified the organization, State Grid sort of did the flip of that, actually created a new set of standards to fit the organization. And this was actually the term that they used, which is why we used this sort of wine and bottles metaphor, as they described it as sort of new wine and old bottles. They have these existing practices, and they get reframed in a way that sort of has this veneer to some extent of sustainability reporting. The interesting thing that we found from doing this study actually is that we chose these companies because one's very global, one's very local to some extent, thinking there'd be a contrast on them. But what we found was most interesting was actually what they did the same. And actually, as it turns out, both of these companies, both of these are central government SOEs, really encouraged by the government to develop tools and techniques that could be actually diffused and spread to other Chinese companies. In fact, almost to some extent delegated the introduction of these global norms and practices to these companies. So the one process that we identified is sort of the development of localized standards. So this was what State Grid did. They actually worked directly with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences at the sort of request of the central government to understand how the global practices and norms could be adapted to the Chinese specific situation, and actually then codified within a set of sort of new Chinese specific standards that could be rolled out to other particularly domestic Chinese companies. And the most interesting thing that we found, and this was one of the things that spurred us to do this study, is that Costco actually developed an MIS system to actually help Chinese companies meet global reporting standards. So Costco, a shipping company, very standard business school theory is the company should focus very much on their sort of core competencies, what they do. Costco is a shipping company, but here they've developed actually a standalone MIS system to sort of monitor, track, and report environmental issues, which is then sold to other companies. And so we talked to a number of the consumers of this product, very globally focused Chinese, particularly SOEs, and they have described that, or sort of Costco described that this was something that they were actually requested to do, to create this system that other Chinese companies could use. So this is the idea of this sort of state mediation of the development of these global skills. So State Grid pioneering this domestic version of the standards to use for globally sort of more domestically focused companies. Costco, it's much more about these internationalization tools to help Chinese companies develop this sort of ability and skills to report on and track their environmental impacts on at a global standard. So the findings are so two things. So one, sort of an obvious thing is that the business focus of the company really determines the way that they actually respond to these global pressures. So, State Grid, really focus on creating a very domestic version. Costco, very international. And though, as I described, that this idea of domestic standards developed and by State Grid to help the other Chinese companies, and then the internationalization tools for Costco. So just a couple quick things in conclusion, because I'm out of time. So we found this very interesting because in some ways the central government is using these SOEs as it's almost like in the United States they talk about sort of private equity companies or venture capital companies using their sort of portfolio companies to share ideas, to develop best practices, and in many ways that's what the central government is doing with these companies, having them develop ways, sort of skills and practices to help globalize other Chinese firms. And I should say though, so that as a final word, so the idea, it's very easy to say that maybe the domestic version of the standards are sort of a watered down, not as rigorous version, and that's probably very much to some extent true. But I think also, without actually the work the State Grid has done to actually put this idea of actually reporting on the map, probably there's virtually no Chinese companies would be doing this, and actually now, a significant percentage of them are actually reporting on some of their environmental and social factors, which allows for all kinds of tracking by civil society, by the government. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.